right, Fact Check This Podcast, and as promised, I said I was going to go through the secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. So this article from Time Magazine came out February 4th of 2021. And I know I covered it a little bit, but I definitely know I didn't read the whole thing in its entirety. And what I've kind of been discovering of late is that not only has this thing largely been forgotten, almost nobody even, or there's a lot of people that didn't even know that it existed to begin with at all, which is just insane to me. But here we are. And also it probably is a testament to how good the mainstream media did of not talking about it, of actively suppressing the fact that it even existed, and of poo-pooing everything that was said in it as, oh, well, this is just being blown out of proportion by right-wing conspiracy theorists and election deniers and blah, 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 so on and so forth. Interesting that they waited until 2 weeks after Joe Biden was sworn in before they released this. I think that's right. I think it was 2 weeks later. Yeah, like insane. Also, the fact that this thing is incredibly long. So we're gonna read through the whole thing, and I'll give commentary here and there as we go. But yeah, I mean, this is very, very long for those who are watching the video, and you can see as I'm scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. 6,800 words for this particular article. The average article for Time Magazine is 1,000 to 2,000 words. 3,000 on like the long end. This is 6,800 words. Incredibly long. What I've also learned in reading a lot of this stuff is the longer it is, the more truth they put in it, because they know that you and the average American aren't going to sit down and read nearly 7,000 words about the 2020 election. Who fucking cares, right? Nobody's going to read all that. It's like this article, for instance. The more they say, the more words these articles are, the longer that it is, the more truth there is in there that they've buried because they know nobody's going to actually read it. This article, for instance, came out during 2020 about Trump's taxes. And this is from the New York Times. The headline is, Trump's taxes show chronic losses and years of income avoidance and of income tax avoidance. Now, this was a 10,400 word article. For reference, an average article in the New York Times is between 650 and 800 words. 1,200 words is considered incredibly long for the New York Times. This was 10,400 words. Nobody's reading all this shit, right? Well, guess what? I did. The headline of Trump's taxes show chronic losses and years of income tax avoidance is objectively false, right off the bat. But the reason that they gave it that headline and the reason that it's 10,000 fucking words is because they give it that headline, and now every leftist without a brain and can't read will now post a link to that or a screenshot of that and say, oh, look, Trump's been tax dodging, blah, 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 blah. And then 10,000 words later, what you find out is that Trump has been telling the truth. He has taken some massive losses on account of running for president, becoming president, everything else that's involved with that. He also has done all of his taxes legally for literally forever. What they call tax avoidance is actually just utilizing the system as it exists to pay as little taxes as you're required to reinvest money into other businesses. Like, It's if you want to see how to actually run your business and how to be successful in managing the tax system as it exists, read this fucking article. It's great. It doesn't say any of the things that the left wanted it to say about how Trump is this like terrible tax dodger, but it did give a lot of it how the tax system works and how Trump utilizes it to his benefit. So yeah, I mean, 10,400 words. And the only thing that anybody on the left ran with was the headline, which says the exact opposite of what the rest of the 10,000 words tell you. Interestingly enough, they don't mince words, and they are 100% fucking when they say that this was a secret shadow campaign. And as far as they're concerned, it saved the 2020 election. Let's get into this. I'll give commentary as we go, but yeah, the whole thing is pretty crazy. A weird thing happened right after the November 3rd election. Nothing. The nation was braced for chaos. Liberal groups had vowed to take to the streets, planning hundreds of protests across the country. Right-wing militias were girding for battle. In a poll before Election Day, 75% of Americans voiced concern about violence. There were no right-wing militias girding themselves for battle. I do 100% fully believe that liberal groups were ready to take to the streets and start burning down their own cities, but by God, we should let them. If they want to burn down every metropolitan area in the country, have at it, you psychopath motherfuckers. Instead, an eerie quiet descended. As President Trump refused to concede, the response was not mass action, but crickets. When media organizations called the race for Joe Biden on November 7th, jubilation broke out instead, as people thronged cities across the U.S. to celebrate the democratic process that resulted in Trump's ouster. This whole thing is hard to read and get through without cringing and wanting to do Fetty type things. But we're going to get through it. A second odd thing happened amid Trump's attempts to reverse the results. Corporate America turned on him. Hundreds of major business leaders, many of whom had backed Trump's candidacy and supported his policies, called on him to concede. To the president, something felt amiss. It was all very, very strange, Trump said on December 2nd. Within days after the election, we witnessed an orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted. In a way, Trump was right. There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes, one that both curtailed the protests and coordinated the resistance from CEOs. Both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and business titans. There it is, right? Both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and the business titans. The pact was formalized in a terse, little-noticed joint statement of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and AFL-CIO published on Election Day. Both sides would come to see it as a sort of implicit bargain, inspired by the summer's massive, sometimes destructive racial justice protests, in which the forces of labor came together with the forces of capital to keep the peace and oppose Trump's assault on democracy. It's always Trump's assault on democracy. Never forget, it's Trump's assault on democracy. Sorry, lost my place. The handshake between business and labor was just one component of a vast cross-partisan campaign to protect the election, an extraordinary shadow effort dedicated not to winning the vote, but to ensuring it would be free and fair, credible and uncorrupted. Make sure that you notice, they say they weren't trying to win the vote. They just wanted to make sure it was free and fair and credible and uncorrupt, right? That's exactly what they go on to explain in great detail how they went about doing, making sure that it was credible and uncorrupt. For more than a year, a loosely organized coalition of operatives scrambled to shore up America's institutions as they came under simultaneous attack from a remorseless pandemic and an autocratically inclined president. Though much of this activity took place on the left, it was separate from the Biden campaign and crossed ideological lines, with crucial contributions by nonpartisan and conservative actors. The scenario the shadow campaigners were desperate to stop was not a Trump victory. It was an election so calamitous that no result could be discerned at all. A failure of the central act of democratic self-governance that has been a hallmark of America since its founding. Instead, what they managed to do through all of this was make it the least believable election in human history. But that's neither here nor there, right? They had to shore it up and make sure that the right guy won. Democracy had to be preserved, except that our founding fathers literally wanted nothing to do with democracy. They wanted a republic, but that's, neither here nor there. Their work touched every aspect of the election. They got states to change voting systems and laws and helped secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. They fended off voter suppression lawsuits, recruited armies of poll workers, and got millions of people to vote by mail for the first time. They successfully pressured social media companies to take a harder line against disinformation and used data-driven strategies to fight viral smears. They executed national public awareness campaigns that helped Americans understand how the vote count would unfold over days or weeks, preventing Trump's conspiracy theories and false claims of victory from getting more traction. After Election Day, they monitored every pressure point to ensure that Trump could not overturn the result. The untold story of the election is the thousands of peoples of both parties who accomplished the triumph of American democracy at its very foundation, said Norm Eisen, a prominent lawyer and former Obama administration official who recruited Republicans and Democrats to the board of the Voter Protection Program. If this isn't all kind of making you scratch your head already, I mean, we're not very far into it. If you haven't already been scratching your head at some of this, I mean, it's unbelievable that they actually, not only that they actually admitted to this literally 2 weeks after Joe Biden was sworn into office, but the fact that the article is still up, is still like available to read like this, is absolutely fucking insane. And the fact that nobody's talking about this now, 2 months in, or 2 months before this year's election, a month and a half after everything we've seen happen with Joe Biden, and then Kamala Harris, who was literally the least popular, the lowest approval rating of a vice president ever in fucking history since they've been taking polls on the approval rating of vice presidents, lowest ever, including after Dick Cheney literally shot somebody in the face. Kamala Harris still had the worst approval ratings ever. Who 6 months ago, the Democratic bigwigs were talking about how do we get her off the ticket and have Biden run with somebody else. And then all of a sudden she becomes the most popular candidate ever overnight just because Biden very strangely stepped down. Like, nobody's talking about this article in the wake of everything we've seen over the last 2-3 months. It's just, it boggles my mind. So anyway, for Trump and his allies were running their own campaign to spoil the election. The president spent months insisting that mail ballots were a Democratic plot and the election would be rigged. Did anybody pay attention to what happened in Michigan, in Georgia, in Arizona? Like, you can't say that it didn't look suspicious, that it was uncorrupted and like that it couldn't be that it was unquestionable. His henchmen, they always use henchmen when talking about Trump. His henchmen at the state level sought to block their use, while his lawyers brought dozens of spurious suits to make it more difficult to vote. It should be difficult to vote. Voting is not something that's a natural human right. Voting is something that you should fucking earn. An intensification of the GOP's legacy of suppressive tactics. Voting is supposed to be suppressive. It's not for everybody. It's for people who have a stake in what's going on. Before the election, Trump plotted to block a legitimate vote count. And he spent the months following November 3rd trying to steal the election he'd lost. The lawsuits and conspiracy theories, pressure on state and local officials, and finally summoning his army of supporters to the January 6th rally that ended in deadly violence at the Capitol. Deadly violence! The only person who was killed was one of the protesters. And everything that's come out since then, with all of the videos we've seen of what was going on in and around the Capitol, kind of point to not anything at all like what they have been claiming that it was for the last 3 years. The democracy campaigners watched with alarm. Every week we felt like we were in a struggle to try to pull off this election without the country going through a real dangerous moment of unraveling, says former GOP Representative Zach Wamp, a Trump supporter who helped coordinate a bipartisan election protection council. We can look back and say this thing went pretty well, but it was not at all clear in September and October that it was going to be the case. This is the inside story of the conspiracy to save the 2020 election, based on access to the group's inner workings, never-before-seen documents, and interviews with dozens of those involved from across the political spectrum. It is the story of an unprecedented, creative, and determined campaign whose success also reveals how close the nation came to disaster. And by to disaster, they mean Donald Trump being reelected, basically, is what constitutes disaster for this group. Every attempt to interfere with the proper outcome of the election was defeated, says Ian Basson, co-founder of Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan rule of law advocacy group. I can guarantee you, if it's called Protect Democracy, it is not bipartisan. It is nonpartisan. It is 100% leftist. But it's massively important for the country to understand that it didn't happen accidentally. The system didn't work magically. Democracy is not self-executing. Well, history will tell more the tale on that, but generally speaking, democracy might not be self-executing, but it is certainly suicidal. But that's for some years down the road. That's why the participants want the secret history of the 2020 election told, even though it sounds like a paranoid fever dream, a well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies, working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information. They were not rigging the election, they were fortifying it. Let me read that one more time, because that's the key takeaway from this. They were not rigging the election. That's a dirty word. They were fortifying it, making sure that it went the way that it was supposed to go, right? It's fortifying. It's not rigging. And they believe the public needs to understand the system's fragility in order to ensure that democracy in America endures. The architect. Sometime in fall of 2019, Mike Podhorzer became convinced the election was headed for disaster and determined to protect it. This was not his usual purview. For nearly a quarter century, Podhorzer, senior advisor to the president of the AFL-CIO, the nation's largest union federation. I wonder why somebody who's a senior advisor to the president of the nation's largest union federation might want to make sure that democracy is fortified, right? Yeah, I wonder who the AFL-CIO is backing in the 2020 election and in the 2024 election. I could guess. I bet I know where their support went, but that's neither here nor there, right? The nation's largest union federation has marshaled the latest tactics and data to help its favored candidates win elections. Unassuming and professional, he isn't the sort of hair-gelled political strategist who shows up on cable news. Among Democratic insiders, he's known as a wizard behind some of the biggest advances in political technology in recent decades. A group of liberal strategists he brought together in the early 2000s led to the creation of the Analyst Institute, a secretive firm that applies scientific methods to political campaigns. He was also involved in the founding of Catalyst, the flagship progressive data company. The endless chatter in Washington about political strategy, Podhorzer believes, has little to do with how change really gets made. My basic take on politics is that it's all pretty obvious if you don't overthink it or swallow the prevailing frameworks whole, he once wrote. After that, just relentlessly identify your assumptions and challenge them. Podhorzer applies that approach to everything. When he coached his now adult son's Little League team in the D.C. suburbs, he trained the boys not to swing at most pitches, a tactic that infuriated both their and their opponents' parents. But they won the team a series of championships. Trump's election in 2016, credited in part to his unusual strength among the sort of blue-collar white voters who once dominated the AFL-CIO, prompted Podhorzer to question his assumptions about voter behavior. He began circulating weekly number-crunching memos to a small circle of allies and hosting strategy sessions in D.C. But when he began to worry about the election itself, he didn't want to seem paranoid. It was only after months of research that he introduced his concerns in his newsletter in October of 2019. The usual tools of data and analytics and polling would not be sufficient in a situation where the president himself was trying to disrupt the election, he wrote. Most of our planning takes us through Election Day, he noted, but we are not prepared for the two most likely outcomes. Trump losing and refusing to concede, and Trump winning. the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote, and corrupting the voting process in key states. So by winning the Electoral College, as the Founding Fathers laid it out, that is corrupting the voting process. And notice that they mention in key states. And by in key states, they mean the swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Minnesota. These are the key states that they're talking about. The ones that are usually pretty contentious. Ohio used to be on that list. Virginia could probably still fall on that list. Corrupting the voting process means to expect that people like show up and vote and prove that you are who you say you are, and that all of the votes get counted in a timely manner without any chicanery or questionable tactics being used. You know, like what happened in Georgia, like what happened in Michigan. Yeah, crazy, right? We desperately need to systematically red team this election so that we can anticipate and plan for the worst we know will be coming our way. Turned out Podhoser wasn't the only one thinking in these terms. He began to hear from others eager to join forces. The Fight Back Table, a coalition of resistance organizations, had begun scenario planning around the potential for a contested election, gathering liberal activists at the local and national level into what they called the Democracy Defense Coalition. Voting rights and civil rights organizations were raising alarms. A group of former elected officials was researching emergency powers they feared Trump might exploit. Protect Democracy was assembling a bipartisan election crisis task force. It turned out that once you said it out loud, people agreed, Podhoser says, and it started building momentum. He spent months pondering scenarios and talking to experts. It wasn't hard to find liberals who saw Trump as a dangerous dictator. No shit. They still do. He hasn't been in office in 4 years, and they still think he's a dangerous dictator, that he's been ruining the country, even though it's Biden and Harris that have been doing it. But Podhoser was careful to steer clear of hysteria. What he wanted to know was not how American democracy was dying, but how it might be kept alive. The chief difference between the U.S. and countries that lost their grip on democracy, he concluded, was that America's decentralized election system couldn't be rigged in one fell swoop. That presented an opportunity to shore it up. Also presents an opportunity to be able to manipulate it in a number of smaller ways without it being blatantly obvious on the larger scale, right? You have to do certain little things here and there so that everybody doesn't pick up that it's, whoa, look at this. Like, if you do one big thing, everybody sees the one big thing and they go, holy shit. But if you do a whole bunch of little things, then it makes it easier to play it off as coincidental, right? The rest of this article will detail all of the little things that they did to shore it up, to fortify the election, to make sure that the counts went the way the counts were supposed to go, right? The alliance. On March 3rd, Podhoser drafted a 3-page confidential memo titled Threats to the 2020 Election. Trump has made it clear that this will not be a fair election and that he will reject anything but his own re-election as fake and rigged, he wrote. That's literally not at all what was said, but anyway. On November 3rd, should the media report otherwise, he will use the right-wing information system to establish his narrative and incite his supporters to protest. The memo laid out 4 categories of challenges: attacks on voters, attacks on election administration, attacks on Trump's political opponents, and efforts to reverse the results of the election. Then COVID-19 erupted at the height of the primary election season. Normal methods of voting were no longer safe for voters or the mostly elderly volunteers who normally staff polling places. But political disagreements, intensified by Trump's crusade against mail-in voting, prevented some states from making it easier to vote absentee and for jurisdictions to count those votes in a timely manner. Chaos ensued. Ohio shut down in-person voting for its primary, leading to minuscule turnout. A poll worker shortage in Milwaukee, where Wisconsin's heavily Democratic black population is concentrated, left just 5 open polling places, down from 182. In New York, vote counting took more than a month. Suddenly, the potential for a November meltdown was obvious. In his apartment in the DC suburbs, Podhorzer began working from his laptop at his kitchen table, holding back-to-back Zoom meetings for hours a day with his network of contacts across the progressive universe. The labor movement, the institutional left, like Planned Parenthood and Greenpeace, resistance groups like the Indivisible and Move On, progressive data geeks and strategists, representatives of donors and foundations, state-level grassroots organizers, racial justice activists, and others. In April, Podhorzer began hosting a weekly 2.5-hour Zoom. It was structured around a series of rapid-fire 5-minute presentations on everything from which ads were working to messaging to legal strategy. The invitation-only gathering soon attracted hundreds, creating a rare, shared base of knowledge for the fractious progressive movement. At the risk of talking trash about the left, there's not a lot of good information sharing, says Anat Senker Osorio, a close Podhorzer friend whose poll-tested messaging guidance shaped the group's approach. There's a lot of not invented here syndrome, and people won't consider a good idea if they didn't come up with it. The meetings became the galactic center for a constellation of operatives across the left who shared overlapping goals but didn't usually work in concert. The group had no name, no leaders, and no hierarchy, but it kept the disparate actors in sync. Pod played a critical behind-the-scenes role in keeping different pieces of the movement infrastructure in communication and aligned, says Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. You have the litigation space, the organizing space, the political people just focused on the W, and their strategies aren't always aligned. He allowed this ecosystem to work together. Protecting the election would require an effort of unprecedented scale. As 2020 progressed, it stretched to Congress, Silicon Valley, and the nation's state houses. It drew energy from the summer's racial justice protests, many of whose leaders were a key part of the Liberal Alliance. And eventually, it reached across the aisle into the world of Trump-skeptical Republicans appalled by his attacks on democracy. At what point, up to that point, had Trump ever attacked democracy, so to speak? They talk about these attacks on democracy all the time, but where has that happened? And most of what they consider an attack on democracy is expecting that people be able to show ID when they show up to vote. How is that what? Anyway, now we get to securing the vote, because this is the most important part. Once you get the vote, it doesn't matter what happens after that. You can do whatever you want. But first and foremost, you got to secure the vote. The first task was overhauling America's bulky election infrastructure in the middle of a pandemic. For the thousands of local, mostly nonpartisan officials who administer elections, the most urgent need was money. They needed protective equipment like masks and gloves and hand sanitizers. They needed to pay for postcards letting people know they could vote absentee, or in some states, to mail ballots to every voter. They needed additional staff and scanners to process ballots. In March, activists appealed to Congress to steer COVID relief money to election administration. Led by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, more than 150 organizers signed a letter to every member of Congress seeking $2 billion in election funding. It was somewhat successful. The CARES Act, passed later that month, contained $400 million in grants to state election administrators. But the next tranche of relief funding didn't add to that number. It wasn't going to be enough. Private philanthropy stepped into the breach. An assortment of foundations contributed tens of millions in election administration funding. The Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative chipped in $300 million. It was a failure at the federal level that the 2,500 local election officials were forced to apply for philanthropic grants to fill their needs, says Amber McReynolds, a former Denver election official who heads the nonpartisan National Vote at Home Institute. McReynolds' 2-year-old organization became a clearinghouse for the nation struggling to adapt. The Institute gave secretaries of state from both parties technical advice on everything from which vendors to use to how to locate drop boxes. Local officials are the most trusted sources of election information, but few can afford a press secretary, so the Institute distributed communication toolkits. In a presentation to Podhorzer's group, McReynolds detailed the importance of absentee ballots for shortening lines at polling places and preventing an election crisis. The Institute's work helped 37 states and D.C. bolster mail voting. But it wouldn't be worth much if people didn't take advantage. Part of the challenge was logistical. Each state has different rules for when and how ballots should be requested and returned. The Voter Participation Center, which in a normal year would have supported local groups deploying canvases door to door to get out the vote, instead conducted focus groups in April and May to find out what would get people to vote by mail. In August and September, it sent ballot applications to 15 million people in key states, 4.6 million of whom returned them. The mailings and digital ads, the group urged people not to wait for Election Day. All the work we have done for 17 years was built on this moment of bringing democracy to people's doorsteps, says Tom LaPoche, the center's CEO. The effort had overcome heightened skepticism in some communities. Many black voters preferred to exercise their franchise in person or didn't trust the mail. National civil rights groups worked with local organizations to get the word out that this was the best way to ensure one's vote was counted. In Philadelphia, for example, advocates distributed voting safety kits containing masks, hand sanitizers, and informational brochures. We had to get the message out that this is safe, reliable, and you can trust it. At the same time, Democratic lawyers battled a historic tide of pre-election litigation. The pandemic intensified the party's usual tangling in the courts, but the lawyers noticed something else as well. The litigation brought by the Trump campaign of a piece with the broader campaign to sow doubt about mail voting was making novel claims and using theories no court has ever accepted, said Wendy Weiser, a voting rights expert at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. They read more like lawsuits designed to send a message rather than achieve a legal outcome. In the end, nearly half the electorate ballots cast by mail in 2020 nearly half of the electorate cast ballots by mail in 2020, practically a revolution in how people vote. About a quarter voted early in person. Only a quarter of voters cast their ballots in the traditional way, in person on Election Day. The disinformation defense. Bad actors spreading false information is nothing new. For decades, campaigns have grappled with everything from anonymous calls claiming the election has been rescheduled to flyers spreading nasty smears about candidates' families. But Trump's lies and conspiracy theories, the viral force of social media, and the involvement of foreign meddlers made disinformation a broader, deeper threat in 2020. What did Trump lie about? Since when has social media favored right-wingers in any way? And where was this foreign involvement? So far, we've heard about Russian collusion all three of the last three presidential elections, and the only actual instance where there has been any sort of legitimate Russian collusion took place in 2016, where the Hillary Clinton camp was the ones who were in contact with the Russian folks. So when are we getting this? When can we get some of this foreign meddling? I'm really waiting for it. Russian collusion. Yeah. Anybody that says Russian collusion, just go ahead and stop listening to them, because they're obviously a fucking retard and don't deserve your time of day. Laura Quinn, a veteran progressive operative who co-founded Catalyst, began studying this problem a few years ago. She piloted a nameless secret project. Why are these all so secret? They all have to be secret. You don't do this kind of shit if it's above board. You don't do it so secretively, the way they do all of this stuff, which she has never before discussed publicly, that tracked disinformation online and tried to figure out how to combat it. One component was tracking dangerous lies that might otherwise spread unnoticed. Researchers then provided information to campaigners or the media to track down the source and expose them. The most important takeaway from Quinn's research, however, was that engaging with toxic content only made it worse. When you get attacked, the instinct is to push back and call it out. And this isn't true, Quinn says. But to call it out and to say that this isn't true, Quinn says. But the more engagement something gets, the more the platforms boost it. The algorithm reads that, this is popular. We want more of it. The solution, she concluded, was to pressure platforms to enforce their rules, both by removing content or accounts that spread disinformation and by more aggressively policing it in the first place. The platforms have policies against certain types of malign behavior, but they haven't been enforcing them. Quinn's research gave ammunition to advocates pushing social media platforms to take a harder line. In November of 2019, Mark Zuckerberg invited 9 civil rights leaders to dinner at his home, where they warned him about the danger of the election-related falsehoods that were already spreading unchecked. It took pushing, urging, conversations, brainstorming, all of that to get to a place where we ended up with more rigorous rules and enforcement, says Vanita Gupta, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, who attended the dinner and also met with Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey and others. Gupta has been nominated Associate Attorney General by President Biden. It was a struggle, but we got to the point where they understood the problem. Was it enough? Probably not. Was it later than we wanted? Yes, but it was really important given the level of official disinformation that they had been using these rules, those rules in place, and were tagging things and taking them down. Associate Attorney General. I wonder if she got the job isn't it funny? Somebody plays like this big of a role in suppression of disinformation and then ends up like getting appointed to a cabinet position. That's just fucking amazing. Spreading the word. Beyond battling bad information, there was a need to explain a rapidly changing election process. It was crucial for voters to understand that despite what Trump was saying, mail-in votes weren't susceptible to fraud, and that it would be normal if some states weren't finished counting the votes on election night. And yet, for all of their work to try to make it seem like this vote counting wasn't susceptible to fraud, you had these massive instances where it looks pretty fucking fraudulent. Dick Gephardt, a Democratic former House leader turned high-powered lobbyist, spearheaded one coalition. We wanted to get a really bipartisan group of former elected officials, cabinet secretaries, military leaders, and so on, aimed mainly at messaging to the public, but also speaking to local officials, the secretaries of states, attorney generals, governors, who would be in the eye of the storm, to let them know we wanted to help, says Gephardt, who worked his contacts in the private sector to put $20 million behind the effort. Walt, the former GOP congressman, worked through the nonpartisan reform group Issue 1 to rally Republicans to the effort. We thought we should bring some bipartisan elements of unity around what constitutes a free and fair election, Walt says. The 22 Democrats and 22 Republicans on the National Council for Election Integrity met on Zoom at least once a week. They ran ads in 6 states. Would you like to guess what the 6 states were? Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Arizona. Those are your 6 states every fucking time. Sometimes Ohio and sometimes Ohio and Virginia and even North Carolina. But I mean, we all know what the battleground states are at this point, right? Like it's not a big secret. We had a rabid Trump supporters who agreed to serve on the council based on the idea that this is honest, Womp says. This is going to be just as important, he told them, to convince the liberals when Trump wins. Whichever way it cuts, we're going to stick together. The Voting Rights Lab and Into Action created state-specific memes and graphics spread by email, text, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, urging that every vote be counted. Together, they were viewed more than 1 billion times. Protect Democracy's election task force issued reports and held media briefings with high-profile experts across the political spectrum, resulting in widespread coverage of potential election issues and fact-checking of Trump's false claims. Again, what false claims did Trump make? They never give examples of any of this stuff. The organizations track, because if they gave examples, it would be like all of the examples that CNN has tried to give or ABC tried to give of Trump making false claims during his debates and stuff like that, where it's not that he said anything false, it's that he may have gotten certain specifics of the details wrong, but overall what he said was actually factually accurate. But that, like, they have to dissect it like that to say that certain minuscule portions of the statement were lies or were incorrect, so that they can discount the entire thing when the entire thing was objectively truth. The organizations tracking polls found the message was being heard. The percentage of the public that didn't expect to know the winner on election night gradually rose until by late October, it was over 70%. Everybody knew we weren't going to know the winner on election night, because if they announced it on election night, then it would actually be probably legitimate, and the longer they give themselves, the more likely they get their results. So, like, that's why we didn't expect the... Everybody knows that this whole fucking thing is rigged, right? Like, I am firmly committed to Dwight Eisenhower was the last legitimately elected president until Trump won in 2016. Every other president from that point, from Eisenhower on, was rigged. Either in favor of the establishment candidate that they knew would be the safe bet, or by outside forces. JFK. But anyway, a majority also believed that a prolonged count wasn't a sign of problems. We knew exactly what Trump was going to do. He was going to try to use the fact that Democrats voted by mail and Republicans voted in person to make it look like he was ahead, claim victory, say the mail-in votes were fraudulent, and try to get them thrown out, says Protect Democracy's Basson. Setting public expectations ahead of time helped undercut those ties. The alliance took a common set of themes from the research Schenker Osorio presented at Podhorser's Zooms. Studies have shown that when people don't think their vote will count or fear casting it will be a hassle, they're far less likely to participate. Throughout election seasons, members of Podhorser's group minimized incidents of voter intimidation and tamped down rising liberal hysteria about Trump's expected refusal to concede. They didn't want to amplify false claims by engaging them or put people off voting by suggesting a rigged game. When you say these claims are fraud or spurious, what people fear is fraud. What people hear is fraud, Schenker Osorio says. What we saw in our pre-election research was that anything that reaffirmed Trump's power or cast him as an authoritarian diminished people's desire to vote. Podhorser, meanwhile, was warning everyone he knew that polls were underestimating Trump's support. The data he shared with media organizations who would be calling the election was tremendously useful to understand what was happening as the voters rolled in. According to a member of a major network's political unit who spoke with Podhorser before Election Day, most analysts had recognized that there would be a blue shift in key battleground states. The surge of votes breaking towards Democrats, driven by tallies of mail-in ballots, but they hadn't comprehended how much better Trump was likely to do on Election Day. Being able to document how big the absentee wave would be and the variance by state was essential. The radical justice uprising sparked by George Floyd's killing in May was not primarily a political movement. The organizers who helped lead it wanted to harness its momentum for the election without allowing it to be co-opted by politicians. Many of those organizers were part of Podhorser's network, from the activists in battleground states who partnered with Democracy Defense Coalition to organizations with leading roles in the movement for Black Lives. Imagine that. The guy who is orchestrating behind the scenes the cabal to fortify the election also had a large number of those in his network who were involved in the Summer of Love of 2020. You create mass hysteria, mass confusion, and drive everything insane, then it's easier to get a result that you want, because there is so much fear out there. The best way to ensure people's voices were heard, they decided, was to protect their ability to vote. We started thinking about a program that would complement the traditional election protection area, but also didn't rely on calling the police, says Nalini Stamp, the Working Families Party's national organizing director. They created a force of election defenders who, unlike traditional poll watchers, were trained in de-escalation techniques. During early voting and on Election Day, they surrounded lines of voters in urban areas with Joy to the Polls effort that turned the act of casting a ballot into a street party. Black organizers also recruited thousands of poll workers to ensure polling places would stay open in their communities. The summer uprising had showed that people power could have a massive impact. Activists began preparing to reprise the demonstrations if Trump tried to steal the election. Americans plan widespread protests if Trump interferes with the election, Reuters reported in October. One of many such stories. More than 150 liberal groups, from the Women's March to the Sierra Club to Color of Change, from Democrats.com to the Democratic Socialists of America, joined the Protect the Results Coalition. The group's now defunct website had a map listing 400 planned post-election demonstrations to be activated via text message as soon as November 4th. To stop the coup they feared, the left was ready to flood the streets. AKA, if we don't win, we're going to fucking riot. You thought the summer of 2020 was bad? Wait till you see what happens if we don't win. And I guarantee you, it will be the same thing this year. Hang around and wait for November 6th. And if it looks like it's leaning towards Trump, they'll start burning fucking cities down. They will make sure that their vote gets fortified so that they win, because if they can't win, they will fucking destroy everything. Yeah, like Trey says with the election stuff, like Nixon and JFK may be exceptions, but look at what happened to them. JFK was an exception in that he wasn't the establishment pick, but his election was definitely not necessarily above board, but he wasn't the establishment pick in that. So Nixon, on the other hand, Nixon was the establishment pick until he became not the establishment pick. Like, he was a war hawk. He was everything that they wanted him to be. And then the more he got into it and started to see what was actually happening and how it was actually working, and being an incredibly intelligent guy, once he started to figure that out, he started to turn away from it. And as soon as he turned on them and he stopped being their guy, then they got rid of him. And you can go back and look at mine and Mark Metz's first episode of the history they don't teach in school. We did a whole episode on Nixon. Nixon's removal was fucking nuts. Anyway, back to this. And the ensuing riots that will happen in the event of a Trump victory, or just the Democrats not soundly winning. Anything questionable that doesn't lean in Democratic favor, then burn it all down. Strange bedfellows. Nobody considers anybody to be strange bedfellows where the left is concerned, but that's neither here nor there. About a week before Election Day, Podhorzer received an unexpected message. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce wanted to talk. The AFL-CIO and the Chamber have a long history of antagonism. Though neither organization is explicitly partisan, the influential business lobby has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Republican campaigns, just as the nation's unions funnel hundreds of millions to Democrats. On one side is labor, on the other side, management, locked in an eternal struggle for power and resources. But behind the scenes, the business community was engaged in its own anxious discussions about how the election and its aftermath might unfold. The summer's racial justice protests has sent a signal to business owners, too: the potential for economy-disrupting civil disorder. With tensions running high, there was a lot of concern about unrest around the election, or a breakdown in our normal way we handle contentious elections, says Neil Bradley, the Chamber's Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer. These worries had led the Chamber to release a pre-election statement with the Business Roundtable, a Washington-based CEOs group, as well as associations of manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers, calling for patience and confidence as votes were counted. But Bradley wanted to send a broader, more bipartisan message. He reached out to Podhorzer through an intermediary both men declined to name. That's always kind of suspicious, right? An intermediary who nobody is willing to give the name of. I wonder who that might have been. Bill Gates. No, I joke. Maybe. Agreeing that their unlikely alliance would be powerful, they began to discuss a joint statement pledging their organization's shared commitment to a fair and peaceful election. They chose their words carefully and scheduled the statement's release for maximum impact. As it was being finalized, Christian leaders signaled their interest in joining, further broadening its reach. The statement was released on Election Day under the names of Chamber CEO Thomas Donahue, AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka, and the heads of the National Association of Evangelicals and the National African American Clergy Network. It is imperative that our election officials be given the space and time to count every vote in accordance with applicable laws, it stated. We call on the media, the candidates, and the American people to exercise patience with the process and trust in our system. Even if it requires more time than usual, the groups added. Although we may not always agree on desired outcomes up and down the ballot, we are united in our call for the American democratic process to proceed without violence, intimidation, or any other tactics that make us weaker as a nation. Showing up and standing down. Election night began with many Democrats despairing. Trump was running ahead of pre-election polling, winning Florida, Ohio, and Texas easily, and keeping Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania too close to call. But Podhorzer was unperturbed when I spoke to him that night. The returns were exactly in line with his modeling. He had been a warning for weeks that Trump voters' turnout was surging. As the numbers dribbled out, he could tell that as long as all the votes were counted, Trump would lose. This guy had been working literally for a year to make sure of this. Obviously, he knew where states were that needed to be fortified. He knew Trump would lose. The Liberal Alliance gathered for an 11 p.m. Zoom call. Hundreds joined. Many were freaking out. It was really important for me and the team in that moment to help ground people in what we had already known was true, says Angela Peoples, director for Democracy Defense Coalition. Podhorzer presented data to show the group that victory was in hand. I mean, look, we got these whole bags of ballots that are about to be delivered in Georgia and Michigan. Just chill out. It's all good. While he was talking, Fox News surprised everyone by calling Arizona for Biden. The public awareness campaign had worked. TV anchors were bending over backward to counsel caution and frame the vote count accurately. The question then became what to do next. The conversation that followed was a difficult one, led by the activists charged with the protest strategy. We wanted to be mindful of when was the right time to call for moving masses of people into the streets. People says, as much as they were eager to mount a show of strength, mobilizing immediately could backfire and put people at risk. Protests that devolved into violent clashes would give Trump a pretext to send in federal agents or troops, as he had over the summer. And rather than elevate Trump's complaints by continuing to fight him, the alliance wanted to send the message that the people had spoken. So they've literally got riot mobs on standby on the phone, just waiting to send them out to start fucking shit up. How insane is that? So the word went out: stand down, protect the results. Announced that it would not be activating the entire national mobilization network today, but remains ready to activate if necessary. On Twitter, outraged progressives wondered what was going on. Why wasn't anyone trying to stop Trump's coup? Where were all the protests? Podhorzer credits the activists for their restraint. They had spent so much time getting ready to hit the streets on Wednesday, but they did it, he says. Wednesday through Friday, there was not a single Antifa versus Proud Boys incident like everyone was expecting. And when that did materialize, I don't think the Trump campaign had a backup plan. Activists reoriented the Protect the Results protest toward a weekend of celebration. Counter their disinfo with our confidence and get ready to celebrate, read the messaging guidance Schenker Osario presented to the Liberal Alliance on Friday, November 6th. Declare and fortify our win. Vibe confident, forward-looking, unified, not passive or anxious. The voters, not the candidates, would be the protagonists of the story. The planned day of celebration happened to coincide with the election being called on November 7th. Activists dancing in the streets of Philadelphia, blasting Beyonce over an attempted Trump campaign press conference. The Trumpers' next confab was scheduled for Four Seasons Total Landscaping outside the city center, which activists believed was not a coincidence. The people of Philadelphia owned the streets of Philadelphia, crows the Working Families Party's Mitchell. We made them look ridiculous by contrasting our joyous celebration of democracy with their clown show. The votes had been counted. Trump had lost. The battle wasn't over. The 5 steps to victory. In Podhorzer's presentations, winning the vote was only the first step to winning the election. After that came winning the count, winning the certification, winning the Electoral College, and winning the transition. Steps that are normally formalities, but that he knew Trump would see as opportunities for disruption. Nowhere would it be more evident than Michigan, where Trump's pressure on local Republicans came perilously close to working, and where liberal and conservative pro-democracy forces joined to counter it. It was around 10 p.m. on election night in Detroit when a flurry of texts lit up the phone of Art Reyes III. A busload of Republican election observers had arrived at the TCF Center where votes were being tallied. They were crowding the vote counting tables, refusing to wear masks, heckling the mostly black workers. Reyes, a Flint native who leads We the People Michigan, was expecting this. For months, conservative groups had been sowing suspicion around urban voter fraud. The language was, they're going to steal the election. There will be fraud in Detroit, long before any vote was cast. He made his way to the arena and sent word to his network. Within 45 minutes, dozens of reinforcements had arrived, and as they entered the arena to provide the counterweight to the GOP observers inside, Reyes took down their cell phone numbers and added them to a massive chain text. Radical justice activist from Detroit, Will Breath, worked alongside suburban women from Femmes for Dems and local elected officials. Reyes left at 3 a.m., handing the text chain over to a disability activist. As they mapped out the steps in the election certification process, activists settled on a strategy of foregrounding the people's right to decide, demanding their voices be heard and calling attention to the racial implications of disenfranchising Black Detroiters. They flooded the Wayne County Canvassing Board November 17th election meeting with on-message testimony. Despite a Trump tweet, the Republican board members certified Detroit's votes. Election boards were one pressure point. Another was GOP-controlled legislatures who Trump believed could declare the election void and appoint their own electors. And so the president invited the GOP leaders of the Michigan legislature, House Speaker Lee Chatfield and Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkley, to Washington on November 20th. It was a perilous moment. If Chatfield and Shirkley agreed to do Trump's bidding, Republicans on other states might be similarly bullied. I was concerned things were going to get weird, says Jeff Timmer, a former Michigan GOP executive director turned anti-Trump activist. Norm Eisen describes it as the scariest moment of the entire election. The Democracy Defenders launched a full-court press, protect democracy's local contacts, researched the lawmakers' personal and political motives. Issue 1 ran television ads in Lansing. The Chambers Bradley kept close tabs on the process. Wamp, the former Republican congressman, called his former colleague Mike Rogers, who wrote an op-ed for the Detroit newspapers, urging officials to honor the will of the voters. 3 former Michigan governors, Republicans John Engler and Rick Snyder, and Democrat Jennifer Granholm, jointly called for Michigan's electoral votes to be cast free of pressure from the White House. Engler, a former head of the Business Roundtable, made phone calls to influential donors and fellow GOP elder statesmen who could press the lawmakers privately. The pro-democracy forces were up against a Trumpified Michigan GOP controlled by allies of Ronna McDaniel, the Republican National Committee chair, and Betsy DeVos, the former education secretary, and a member of a billionaire family of GOP donors. On a call with his team on November 18th, Basson vented that his size pressure was no match for what Trump could offer. Of course, he's going to try to offer them something, Basson recalls, thinking, head of the Space Force, ambassador to whatever. We can't compete with that by offering carrots. We need a stick. If Trump were to offer something in exchange for a personal favor, that would likely constitute bribery, Basson reasoned. He phoned Richard Primus, a law professor at the University of Michigan, to see if Primus agreed and would make the argument publicly. Primus said he thought the meeting itself was inappropriate and got to work on an op-ed for Politico, warning that the state attorney general, a Democrat, would have no choice but to investigate. Then the piece posted on November 19th. The attorney general's communications director tweeted it. Protect Democracy soon got word that the lawmakers planned to bring lawyers to the meeting with Trump the next day. Reyes activists scanned flight schedules and flocked to the airports on both ends of Shirkley's journey to D.C. to underscore that the lawmakers were being scrutinized. After the meeting, the pair announced they pressed the president to deliver COVID relief for their constituents and informed him they saw no role in the election process. Then they went for a drink at the Trump Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. A street artist projected their images onto the outside of the building, along with the words, "The world is watching." It's interesting that they talk about like pressure and intimidation and stuff like that. All of this is like incredibly intimidating type of behavior, but they don't view it as intimidation on their own part whenever they do this sort of stuff. It's just fortifying the election. It's just protecting democracy. It's just holding people accountable. Sure, it's not intimidation or stalking or threatening or anything like that. That left one last step The state canvassing board, made up of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, 1 Republican, a Trumper, employed by the DeVos family political nonprofit, and was not expected to vote for certification. The other Republican on the board was a little-known lawyer named Aaron Van Langveld. He sent no signals about what he planned to do, leaving everyone on edge. When the meeting began, Reyes activists flooded the live stream and filled Twitter with their hashtag all eyes on me, M-I, Michigan. A board accustomed to attendance in the single digits suddenly faced an audience of thousands. In hours of testimony, the activists emphasized their message of respecting voters' wishes and affirming democracy rather than scolding the officials. Van Langveld quickly signaled he would follow precedent. The vote was 3-0 to certify. The other Republican abstained. After that, the dominoes fell. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the rest of the state certified their electors. Republican officials in Arizona and Georgia stood up to Trump's bullying. And the Electoral College voted on schedule on December 14th. Excuse me. How close we came. There was one last milestone on Podhorser's mind, January 6th, on the day Congress would meet to tally the electoral count. Trump summoned his supporters to D.C. for a rally. Much to their surprise, the thousands who answered his calls were met by virtually no counter-demonstrators. That's where it starts to get suspicious right away, right? To preserve safety and ensure they wouldn't be blamed for any mayhem, the activist left was strenuously discouraging counter activity. Podhorser texted me the morning of January 6th with a cross fingers emoji. Trump addressed the crowd that afternoon, peddling the lie that lawmakers or Vice President Mike Pence could reject states' electoral votes. He told them to go to the Capitol and fight like hell. Then he returned, which is, again, taken out of context as everything he says is. Then he returned to the White House as they sacked the building, as they were allowed in with no opposition, right? As lawmakers fled for their lives, also didn't happen, and his own supporters were shot and trampled. Trump praised the rioters as very special, another thing that didn't happen and that he didn't do. It was his final attack on democracy, and once again it failed. By standing down, the democracy campaigners outfoxed their foes. We're not going into what happened on January 6th and the FBI and the Capitol Police and all of their involvement in all of the activities and everything else. Trying not to get taken down from YouTube today. So we won't talk about that stuff. But holy fucking shit, like, yeah. We won by the skin of our teeth, honestly, and that's an important point for folks to sit with, says the Democracy Defense Coalition's people. There's an impulse for some to say voters decided and democracy won, but it's a mistake to think that this election cycle was a show of strength for democracy. It shows how vulnerable democracy is. Democracy wouldn't work if it wasn't for a cabal of very powerful, rich individuals behind the scenes making sure that it all works the way it's supposed to work, right? The way it's supposed to work. The members of the Alliance to Protect the Election have gone their separate ways. The Democracy Defense Coalition has been disbanded, though the fight back table lives on. Protect Democracy and the good government advocates have turned their attention toward pressing reforms in Congress. Left-wing activists are pressuring the newly empowered Democrats to remember the voters who put them there, while civil rights groups are on guard against further attacks on voting. Business leaders denounced the January 6th attack, and some say they will no longer donate to lawmakers who refuse to certify Biden's victory. Podhorser and his allies are still holding their Zoom strategy sessions, gauging voters' views and developing new messages. And Trump is in Florida facing his second impeachment, deprived of the Twitter and Facebook accounts he used to push the nation to its breaking point. As I was reporting on this article in November and December, I heard different claims about who should get the credit for thwarting Trump's plot. Liberals argued the role of bottom-up people power shouldn't be overlooked, particularly the contributions of people of color and local grassroots activists. Others stressed the heroism of GOP officials like Van Langeveld and Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who stood up to Trump at considerable cost. The truth is that neither likely could have succeeded without the other. It's astounding how close we came, how fragile all this really is, says Timmer, the former Michigan GOP executive director. It's like when Wile E. Coyote runs off the cliff. If you don't look down, you don't fall. Our democracy only survives if we all believe and don't look down. You just don't look down and see how they're actually like holding this thing up, and then you can believe that it's not failing. That this isn't a giant rigged fucked system. Democracy won in the end. The will of the people prevailed. But it's crazy in retrospect that this is what it took to put on an election in the United States of America. And it doesn't show the editing history on this, but this has been drastically changed from the original release. The original release had a lot more about Georgia and Arizona in particular. Early in 2019, starting in like March of 2019, they were going into Georgia and Arizona and putting ballot initiatives in place to make the elections easier, to ensure that everybody could vote without having to prove who you were. They were also using some of that same lawfare type stuff in Pennsylvania, and I want to say it was Wisconsin, but it might have been Minnesota. But they were using the lawfare stuff to basically ensure like mass mail-in ballots, like just send a ballot to everybody. Like if the ballot gets filled out and sent back in, then it gets counted. They're like trying to create ways, as the way that they say it, create ways to ensure democracy and to protect the right to vote, while in actuality not upholding any sort of a level of checks and balances on how the vote is being counted or conducted, or who's even voting, or like what's going on. So Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, again, I'm pretty sure it was either Wisconsin or Minnesota. But anyway, like there was a lot more information in this article about those states and the lawfare that had started in some of it even as early as like late 2018, going through 2019 to set the table for these mass mail-in votings and stuff in 2020, because the Democrats know that mass mail-in voting is the only way that they win. If people actually like show up to the polls and vote, then Democrats lose every time. They have to have all these mail-in ballots. You know, you get like the Michigan or the Georgia cases where they just like literally bring in truckloads of ballots and just drop them off. Like, what? And we're supposed to believe that this is free and fair and like not corrupt in any way? Yeah, sure, absolutely. On a positive note, Arizona worked to shore that up after 2020. Not as successfully as they would have liked, as 2022 evidenced, but I think they've taken further steps to get that to get some of that taken care of. Georgia took some massive steps to shore up their election process following 2020. So, you know, there's not really high odds that we see a lot of the same kind of chicanery that we saw in 2020, especially without the presence of pandemic and everything else. But still, I mean, can anybody really think that any election is legitimate like ever again after what we saw? Like after reading an article like that, where now you know that there are literally like thousands of people with hundreds upon millions of dollars that they're just throwing anywhere and everywhere to make sure that the election goes their way. This whole thing is fucked. Like this is why the founding fathers wanted to avoid actual like true democracy. It was supposed to be a republic. It was supposed to be restrictive voting that was only for the people who had a stake in it, so that you don't have this kind of bullshit. And here we are. This is every experiment of democracy ultimately fails. Generally speaking, they fail around 250 to 300 year mark. Anybody want to guess how close we're getting? 1776. So getting close to that 250. I mean, it's all crazy. Pay attention. Pay attention to what's happening on election night and how all of that's shaking out. I know I will be. I don't know if I'll be able. I work that night, so I don't know if I'll be able to actually like be on streaming what's going on and stuff. But I will try my damnedest to do something commentary wise on it and at least get something out there when it's happening, because I want that shit to be on record. We need to be paying attention to this stuff and see it as it unfolds. So it'll be fun. It'll be entertaining, if nothing else. That's it for today. Go check out those 2 articles. Read it for yourself, The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. I'll link it in the show notes. Also, go check out the Trump's taxes show chronic losses and years of income tax avoidance, the New York Times article I was talking about. That is a very fun read if you've got some time to just sit and read it. Doesn't say anything at all what they said that it said, but it is pretty cool. That's all I got. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I'm not sure. I'm on my midweek rotation here for the next couple weeks. So I'm not sure when I'll be back with another episode. As soon as I get something scheduled with either Mark or Don or Dag or something. I'm not sure what the scheduling is going to look like with Don, with all he had go on with the J6 stuff and his recent arrest. But anyway, we'll see. We'll figure something out, I'm sure. That'll do it for today. Have a good rest of your week. I will see you later.